Okay, today we're dealing with two different things. We're working with absolute value and we're working with opposites. For absolute value, you're just looking at how far away from 0 on the number line the number is. So the absolute value for -4 and the absolute value for +4 would both be 4 because they're both 4 units away from 0 on the number line. If we're dealing with opposites, basically that's just taking the opposite of a number. So if I give you 7, the opposite of 7 is going to be -7. So it sounds really easy, and it is as long as you pay attention, but it can get a little bit complicated because we're going to add with absolute value, we're going to subtract with absolute value, and we're going to find the opposites. The opposites are very easy. If it's got a negative sign, you change it to positive. If it's a positive number, you change it to negative with the same digit. So the opposites are very easy, but the absolute value can get a little tricky if you don't pay attention. So we're going to switch over to the screen. Going to go over the definitions for both really quick. Alright, so for absolute value, the distance between a number and 0 on the number line is called absolute value. For opposites, it's going to be opposites are the numbers that are the same distance from 0 in opposite direction. Since 0 is not negative or positive, 0 is its own opposite. So that's a special case that you only remember for 0. The opposite of a number is itself. For example, the opposite of 3 is -3, which is 3. That's a little bit confusing there. So the opposite of 3 is -3. But the opposite of the opposite, basically you're just flip-flopping it twice. You're going to the opposite of 3, which is -3, and then the opposite of -3 comes back to 3. So if it's the opposite, you just switch the sign, whether it's positive or negative. If it says the opposite of the opposite, it's going to come back to being the original number. It just basically it cancels out what it did in the first place. So that can be a little bit confusing, but just make sure you read carefully. If it says the opposite, you change it. If it says the opposite of the opposite, you leave it the same. Alright, so first example here says find the opposite of -5. So if we go from the opposite of -5, the same distance away from 0 on the number line in the opposite direction is going to be +5. So it's pretty simple. So you go down to the next example. It says find the opposite of 4. So it's going to be -4. It says, alright, down here on A and B, it says, what is the opposite of 3? The opposite of 3 is going to end up being -3. So -3 would be the answer here. This one says, what is the opposite of -2? So that's opposite and opposite, so they cancel out, and the answer is going to be the original number, which is -2. So here it changed because it said, what is the opposite? Here it ended up changing back to the original because it said the opposite of the opposite. So be very careful in how you read them. Alright. So absolute value. Absolute value, you're going to see it represented by a number, so like -7. If you see it inside of bars like this means absolute value. This is how it's going to be represented. So if I see this, it's wanting me to tell it how many units away from 0 on a number line this is. So -7 is 7 steps away from 0 on the number line in the direction of the left. But that doesn't matter. It just wants to know how many steps it is, whether it's left or whether it's right, positive or negative. So the answer to this absolute value of -7 is going to be 7. Absolute value of 3. 3 is 3 places away from 0 on the number line. So absolute value of 3 is going to be 3. Where this can get a little bit tricky is if I have a problem like, say, -7, the absolute value of -7 minus the absolute value of 3. So I have to rewrite this problem. So the absolute value of -7, which we set up here, is 7. So I have to rewrite it as 7, bring down my minus sign, and then the absolute value of 3 is 3. So it becomes 7 minus 3 equals 4. You have to do this step. You have to do the rewrite step. If you do not do the rewrite step, you're going to screw it up. You don't want to do that. Take the time, rewrite the question, get the correct answer, and let this be as simple as it actually is. So if we have a few different sample problems, if we have the absolute value of 14 equals, so we'll make that A, have B is absolute value of -9 plus the absolute value of 3, and then we have C is absolute value of -8 minus the absolute value of -2. Alright, at this time you're going to work these three out, and then I'm going to work them out after you work them out on your own. So pause the video now and work them out. Alright, so the absolute value of 14, we know that the absolute value means how far it is away from 0 on the number line. Well, the absolute value of 14 is going to be 14. On these, so that's your answer there for A. On B, coming down, the absolute value of -9 is 9. I bring down my addition symbol. Absolute value of 3 is 3. 9 plus 3 is 12. And then for C, the absolute value of -8 is 8. Bring down my subtraction symbol. The absolute value of -2 is 2. 8 minus 2 is 6. So these are very simple here. So I'm going to do D, E, and F over here, and I'm going to say the opposite of 13, opposite of -7, and the opposite of the opposite of -12. Alright, at this time, you're going to pause it and work out these three. Pause it now. Alright, so for D, the opposite of 13 is going to be -13. We just go the opposite side of 0, the same amount of places over, and it's going to be -13. The opposite of 7, or -7, we go to the other side of the number line of 0, and it's going to be the same distance away, would be +7. For F, it says the opposite of the opposite, so we go from -12 over to 12, and then back over to -12. So they cancel out, you end up with the same number you start with, so your answer is -12. That's all I have for you today on the absolute value. The only thing that I will say is if there's a symbol outside of the outside of the absolute value, it stays. So I'll do one example of that real quick. Don't let this confuse you based on the rest of it. So if I have the absolute value of -7 plus the absolute value of 2, but I have a negative symbol outside, if the negative symbol is outside of the absolute value, it will stay. So I'll bring it down as well as this. I'll bring this down and this down. Do the absolute value of -7, which is 7, and then the absolute value of 2, which is 2, and then you end up with -7 plus 2. So we will get to that. We're not there yet, but this is something that you will see in the future. But for today, all the other examples are how we're going to do the problems. So we will get to this later, but this is just a little preview of what's to come.